What would be fantastic would be to try and get you do it in the beginning of the book, get a sense of how you got to the idea of the rights of nature, etc., and what has happened over that period. And,
sure. So
even
do you want
beyond the writing of the
to record it? Oh, you're recording. That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So in terms of the agenda, I'm happy to do that. So I guess, as you say, I do deal with it a little bit in wild law, but the essence of it was that I became an environmental lawyer because I thought that if you look at, I suppose I've been aware since I was probably a teenager that the fundamental issue facing humanity are ecological issues, and obviously they're very connected with social issues as well. But I mean, I think if you were an alien coming to this planet to study it, you would conclude that there's one dominant issue, and that there's one species which is changing the chemistry and the face of the planet so radically that it's threatening most life forms, and how that plays out is the critical issue. So I thought, okay, human behavior is causing this. Law is the primary means of regulating human conduct to make sure that people behave stop them behaving in an antisocial way, and so environmental law can fix this. So I proceeded happily on that basis for some years and focused particularly on drafting legislation because I thought that would have a wider effect. And then I began to realize that there were some problems that I couldn't fix with better drafting. It wasn't a question of finding the right words. And I was busy grappling with I was aware that there was something the problem was deeper than the law, preceded the law. And around that time, I was introduced to Thomas Berry, and that really helped me. It gave me the end of the string that I could unravel. And really, what I hadn't appreciated is that the legal system as a whole is designed to facilitate and legitimize exploitation of nature, and that although environmental law, as a subset of that legal system, does help prevent the worst excesses of it, it's a kind of an add-on, and the driving force of the whole system is to allow it, and also legitimize in the sense to, if you give somebody a mining permit or a license, I mean, the words indicate approval, so then the question is, why is the law like that? And the law is like that because of the kind of worldview or cosmology, if you like, of the dominant cultures. And that's tied up with capitalism, of course, but not only with capitalism, because the Soviet Union wasn't very great on the environment either. And so then I think there are many different interpretations, but I think in European thought, I think Thomas Berry, as far as I've been able to ascertain, is right in identifying the Age of Enlightenment as a key time when you saw a very definite shift away from ideas of an animate universe and a focus on maintaining good relations with Earth as a whole and with the other species, other aspects, other beings, to the idea of it as mechanism, and for us as the only creatures with souls, as it were, that was used, I think, to differentiate us from everything else and legitimize the dominance. But of course, as Thomas once observed rather well, I thought, he in order for all these arguments about human exceptionalism, that we're different and we're entitled to be superior or dominant or whatever, in order for those to be true, you would have to point to what he referred to as a radical discontinuity in the process of evolution. I mean, at what point is there some radical break which puts us in a different category from everything else? And of course, the evidence just isn't there. We are mammals like other mammals, and we've evolved through a process which means that if we traced our ancestry back, we would arrive at a point where we share a common ancestry with rocks and rivers and mountains and trees and everything, which is what indigenous people have always said. So from that point of view, the indigenous idea that we are all relations, as the North American First Nations said, is not just metaphor there's a literal truth to it as well. But of course, the power of it is that it focuses on the importance of maintaining relationships, reciprocal relationships, rather than an attitude of just taking. And so then when I first heard Thomas say, everything should have rights, I mean, I must admit I sort of recoiled from it, thinking, just the notion of animal rights is so hugely controversial, and now to extend it beyond that, it's just not practical. And anyway, I went away and sort of thought about it, but I soon realized that what was going on was that I was confusing, what I was worried about was difficulty. I mean, pragmatic issues about how you implement it, and that is entirely separate from whether it's logical or correct. When I thought through it, I thought, no, the logic of this is very strong. It may be difficult to implement, but that's a separate question. So anyway, but it also it resonated very strongly with me in terms of how I've experienced the world, I suppose. So I think I wasn't, I suppose, put off by the fact that it was an enormous challenge, because in my view it's a much more accurate map of reality than the current system. So that the difference, the ultimate test, you can believe that the sun goes around the earth as everybody used to believe. Well, maybe not everybody, but most people used to believe. But the reality is the opposite, and the earth will carry on going happily around the sun, regardless of what we believe, and eventually that reality impinges to the extent that it destroys the theories, the incorrect theories. So I think the same principle applies here, is that it's a situation where the logic behind this is the logic of nature, and it's so strong that it will impinge and will ultimately, and I think that's what's happening at the moment, is that as environmental crises worsen, as the impacts on humanity become stronger, it becomes clearer that the emperor has no clothes, and people are reluctant to accept that, but nature is just turning up the volume, and so in a way the reality will prevail. It must prevail, but whether that will be before it's too late for humanity and many other species, I don't know. So in that sense, I think an important point to get, which a lot of people don't get, is that I'm not talking about ideology. I'm not talking about an intellectual debate between capitalism and communism and which is correct. I'm talking about the nature of reality, or the nature of being, if you want to put it that way. So I don't think it's ideological. I don't think whether the sun moves around the earth or the earth moves around the sun is ideological. I think it's fact, and only one of those can be true. And so I don't think it can be true that humans are different to everything else and can run the planet. So that means that the political process that one's engaged in, is a process of, first of all, addressing dissociation, that people think they experience themselves as separate, and secondly, is a process of persuading people to abandon their misconceptions. In other words, take off their blinkers, if you like. It's the reality that we're arguing for is already there. It's not a question of winning the argument in order to bring that to happen. The only question is how long it will take people to take off their blinkers. And I mean, that's a huge question, of course. So one of the things that become interested in is that one of the ways of translating indigenous cosmologies into a language that the dominant cultures can understand is to use the language of law, which also has the advantage that it's a powerful language in the sense that it can have consequences, and it's connected with the power of the state to make things happen. So as the law is currently formulated, it's not possible for a court to see anything other than a human being or a legal person like a corporation as a being. And this relates to the question of legal personality. So a lot of people who've written about rights of nature have misunderstood this. And you see people taking offense at why should a mountain be a person, a legal person that's trying to be anthropocentric and make them a person. But actually the term legal personality comes from persona, the Latin term for the masks that were used in theatrical plays. And obviously probably goes back to the Greeks actually, but the idea is, you wore a mask so that in the drama people could tell what your role was, that you were a goodie or a baddie or a whatever. Now, obviously, the mask is not the person. It's something the person puts on as a signifier, so that you can understand their role in the drama.
Legal personhood, the corporate entity, is similar, you suggest?
Yes, yeah. So legal personality is from persona, not meaning really a person, but a mask. So at the moment, nature wears, or either hasn't got a mask at all and can't be, you could say, argues invisible in the court, or to the extent that it has a mask, its mask says property, object. So until such time, and as soon as it says property or object, it means that by definition it can't have rights. And there's no duties owed to it. It's just a question of who gets to make the decisions about what happens to it. Which is normally the owner. So the question then is the struggle for legal personality. Obviously, a forest doesn't give a damn about whether you think it's a legal person or not. But to engage the machinery of the state and the courts, they need to be able to see that this is a being capable of having rights, and so that's what that's about. It's not about trying to say that mountains must be like people. It's about giving them the right mask, and of course that is a way of reanimating the universe, because while you see the universe as object, we have impoverished humanity because we now live in a dead world of objects. One of my favorite sayings from Thomas Berry is that he said the universe is not a collection of objects, it's a communion of subjects. It is an interrelationship between subjects, and it's held together by that communion, that interrelationship. It's not a construction of objects. And that one statement, if you shift from seeing the world as a collection of objects to a communion of subjects, it changes everything. It changes how you view every single discipline, because it's a shift in worldview, which is so fundamental. So if you make that shift, then it raises, I think it raises very exciting possibilities of rethinking a lot of human knowledge. When I say human knowledge, of course, the indigenous knowledge is there already, and it's not going to. Are the bees worrying you? Sally, don't do this. It makes them angry.
You put on hold.
No, I'll just say this.
Oh, okay.
Sally, if they worry, you can put this on.
Yeah, sorry.
I
Sorry.
learned that from my film.
Sorry, it kind of interrupted
No.
the
Bees also have rights.
Yeah, exactly. These my bees are. I had them put it anyway.
But not Bezos.
So I have to. It keeps going off if I haven't No, that's fine. Just checking that they're not arranging interviews.
No, that's a fantastic way in which you're building this argument up. So let's continue.
Good.
Great. Yeah.
So I was talking about sorry, I lost the drift. I was talking about
the legal entity and animating
oh yes, that's right.
life through this idea of being a part of a communion of subjects.
So it's, at a personal level, it's a lot more interesting to be in a world where you can approach, say, a tree, and with the attitude of, oh, you look interesting. Who are you? Let me get to know you. As opposed to it just being an object that you walk past like a lamppost. So it's very fundamentally, and it changes, of course. It raises immediately the question of what is the role of the human within this community of life. What are we good for? And everything's got a role, and that's a really big question. So it goes to the heart of what it means to be human, and what one's responsibilities, functions, roles are. But it also, on the more legal side, obviously it raises the question of agency on the part, which you touched on earlier, and agency on the part of other than human actors, and that raises all kinds of interesting questions. Somebody wrote a paper, I forget her name, she was from South America, but she talked about cosmo beings, which was a lovely term for. So she pointed out, for example, that there was a case some years ago where a community, where I think it was Vedanta mining company wanted to mine a mountain in India which was regarded as sacred. So the local people organized around protecting the mountain, because it was to them it was a sacred being. So she was pointing out at that point the mountain becomes a political actor or social actor, and equally recognizing the rights of nature, or no, recognizing that other things are legal beings has that effect. It creates actors which are other than human.
The PHA case, the aquifer, became a kind of actant, Latour uses the term, but yeah, in the courtroom, without Cato Regan necessarily reading this literature, it seemed, because that's why that case, and Matthew followed it too closely.
Okay.
They've gone back to the drawing board. The developers have to show that their development won't impact adversely on the aquifer.
Oh, that's
in the
fantastic.
context of climate change and water scarcity. So it seems to be
Yeah.
entering into the courtroom space. And that's when there's a lot of translation that you're doing here. So it's a kind of philosophical, ontological
Yeah.
take on our relationship to the world. And you've been doing a lot of really early pioneering work on the translation into law, which is almost tactical. It's like getting people who may not buy into that, who may still think investment and extraction are important to grow the economy, and all which is very much alive in our context.
Yeah.
How you feed our people, give them jobs, draw investment. So, I mean, since you wrote the book, a lot has happened. And what's your sense of where things are going? Because you've also been involved in the Colobeni case and a whole range, and now with Shell.
Yeah, although most of my work has been international rather than in South Africa, but yes, I have been involved in those at a practical level, which is also, I guess, informed my understanding of these things. So, I think after writing Wild Law, I realized that I thought about, okay, Wild Law was not an attempt to be practical. It was just an attempt to say there's an alternative way of looking at this, so in that sense, it's more, I suppose, more of a visionary kind of thing, saying you could do things very differently. But then, after writing it, I thought, okay, but in order for that to happen, in order to make a very big change in the world, I think you need a lot of people behind you. And I thought about where it could come from, and I didn't think it would come from government or business or academic institutions, and I thought it has to come from civil society, but also from communities who have never lost that perspective, which are primarily indigenous peoples. So then we, there was a process, but initially after Ecuador adopted I think it's dealt with in the last chapter of the second edition to some extent, but Ecuador adopts this constitution which recognizes the rights of nature, and that destroys the argument that it's impossible. Then the failure of the Copenhagen COP, and Evo Morales from Bolivia calls this People's World Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth in Bolivia. But because the Bolivians had invited me to Copenhagen to speak on rights of nature, they knew me and they asked me to lead the drafting of this Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, and that was adopted by this conference of 35,000 people. So there was and it really was a people's power thing. There were, I think it was about 17 working groups, I forget, either 13 or something. And then at the end of it, they reported back to the governments. So the governments were the recipients of this thing rather than the decision makers. And there were quite a lot of governments there, including the South African government. But then that, I think, really gave the ideas impetus in the social movements around the world, because a lot of the social movements were there, and even if they hadn't come across this idea or were necessarily completely au fait with it, it had legitimacy, it had street credibility, if you like, because of the process. And for example, many years later, I discovered that there were people in Mauritius who'd stood for election on rights of nature, because they had been they were from social movements and they'd been in Bolivia and they'd picked up the ideas and they were campaigning on them in Mauritius. And they have an ecology school there that teaches some of the, well, I've taught it before. But anyway, the movement, okay, then after Bolivia, there was a man by the name of Bill Twist who works for the Pachamama Foundation in San Francisco, and he'd been involved in the process to get rights of nature into the Ecuadorian constitution, and then he came to Bolivia and he saw what happened, and I met him there, and he said to me, look, I think this is an idea that really could be one of the ideas that changes the world, but what do you think you have to do to make this happen? And I said, well, I don't know exactly, but I would start by getting all the people we know working on these ideas around the world into one room and ask them that question. And so that happened later that year in Ecuador, and by halfway through the first morning we decided we needed a global alliance, and so that night I drafted the constitution and we kind of signed up the next day, and that's how it happened. So that was a very significant thing, and now that organization you can find on the web and stuff is powerful, is gaining momentum. We're establishing hubs now to try and, obviously because of how it started, it was very centralized, but now we're trying to decentralize it. So there's an indigenous council, there's a youth hub, there's a Latin American hub, there's a European hub. I've got a mandate and started the process of establishing an African hub myself, and Nemo Basi from Nigeria. And it would be up and running if I weren't so busy, but it isn't. But as these ideas have, so they started off as quite crazy, but then as it started, so it started off academics being interested in it, and then after a while, once there were actual laws and texts, that also meant that academics had something to work with, and then you started getting more and more court cases. So, for example, the Colombian Constitutional Court recognized the river as right. The Indian High Court, Bangladesh. These are all situations where it wasn't really because of the movement. They were just, in a way, the courts were responding to problems which were difficult to face. A bit like the example you given of the aquifer here in Cape Town, it's practical to say what's in the best interest of the aquifer, and in a situation where there's the rivers getting polluted all over, it makes it kind of cuts to the chase rather than seeing it just in terms of the individual actors. That's the central issue, so it's gained. I don't know if you've looked at the United Nations Harmony with Nature website, but they track developments around the world, and there's a lot on that website already, and it's getting faster and faster. So I would say, to answer your question, Stephen, I would say that there was an initial period of kind of academic interest. Then there was followed by a kind of Latin American, I don't know what the right word is, almost an eruption, where you had, in quick order, you had, I think it was 2008 was the Ecuadorian Constitution, 2010 Bolivia, the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, and now you had an articulation of these ideas in a form that had a degree of popular support. And then, of course, we had cases in Ecuador itself based on that, and there was a group of Latin American states. They call themselves ALBA, A-L-B-A, but I think it's a Bolivarian Alliance for something or other. But they took it on very closely, and I'm not sure what's happened to ALBA. It nearly seemed to die, and now it's had mixed fortunes. But they had a very interesting thing at one stage, which Evo Morales of Bolivia was pushing when he was president. Largely, I think, because he is an indigenous person himself, so he has some understanding of this, and he was pushing what he called a diplomacy of life. So he was saying, that I think correctly, that the key thing about this planet is life, but that's not what's focused on, and that if we were all trying to promote that, it would be a good thing. And he also, the ALBA countries made some very strong declarations saying that, that this century, just as last century was the century of human rights, this needs to be contextualized, and that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a species-specific articulation of rights, but it, what sits around it, there's a whole lot of other beings, and so that, in a sense, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a kind of wraparound that wraps around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think there has a huge amount of potential. So I've established a Wild Law Institute to take these ideas further, and it's hard to extract myself from the law firm because there's always these urgent things. But certainly, I think there's a lot of potential for taking these ideas forward. But even so, it's a very interesting thing about at what point is something law, because if you have enough people behind something, they follow it, whether it's law or not,
And I think maybe its time has arrived or is arriving, because also around, so PHA campaign, aquifer gets interim protection, recognition in law as a entity that needs to be protected in a post-day zero climate change world. Now, the River Club is going for national protection under cultural heritage legislation, and that may well happen because the First Nations have mobilized around it. So the symbolic power of that, there are all sorts of things that could, in fact, bring that together. Because the mountain is the source for all of this.
Yes. No, I'm sort of annoyed with myself that I didn't start it years ago when I thought of it, because it would have changed these things. I mean, we were just having a conversation now. We really, it's because of the fact that the judge got sick and we haven't been able to get into court, and there's been this argument they won't really assign a judge, and now the advocates aren't available. I was just having the conversation immediately before you arrived. It's very difficult to see how we can win now, because if they'll have built the bloody thing by the time we get to court. I'm exaggerating slightly. I don't know exactly how far they will have got, but they'll have got very far.
Stories now. I just drive past.
Is it 2 already?
Yeah.
So I mean, and that really is justice denied, delayed being justice denied, as because we haven't even been able to put our story. and before the court, and there is no doubt about that case. If you look at it, if you started from the point of view of what's in the best interest of the river, or if the rivers plural were able to be represented in that thing, well, I mean, I guess I can't say that it wouldn't have been, but I think that the discussion would have been completely different. Maybe there's an argument to be made that the best interest of the river is to be diverted, but it would be a hard argument to make, the whole and the arguments for the First Nations people who are opposed to the River Club are arguments about relationship between place and culture, and that's fun, and that implications for identity and interestingly, very interestingly, there's a group that applied for admission as an amicus curiae. They want to argue for this question of cultural recuperation. Are you familiar with the fact that they've applied?
I heard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a Forest Peoples project, and they've been
That's
represented
right.
by the Legal Resources Centre. But those are very interesting arguments, which would be fascinating to ventilate. So the kind of argument, as I understand it, broadly speaking, is that most cases about Indigenous people where Indigenous people are on their lands, and they're trying to stop people coming take it away from them. But if you look at the world as a whole, in most places, colonization has been ruthlessly effective, and Indigenous people are no longer on their lands, and they have been, and to what extent, and their cultures have been smashed. So to what extent should we be protecting the right of people to reconnect and recover their cultures? And I think that's a very interesting question, and it's fundamentally tied to what I've been talking about. I mean, to an extent, what I'm talking about could be characterized as a re-indigenization of people. I mean, we are all, of course, indigenous to the planet. We may not be in exactly the same place that our genetic makeup was evolved, but re-indigenization in the sense I'm really talking about how we perceive ourselves. Do we perceive ourselves to be indigenous to this place, and therefore have responsibilities to it, to protect it, and and to maintain good relations with the other beings there, or do we see ourselves as dissociated creatures who it doesn't really matter if we're in London or New York or Cape Town, and we may be in either of those at any next week, in that sense, they are very deep questions, I think. Sorry, I've got probably too philosophical for what you're wanting.
No. I mean, it is philosophical, and I suppose if we go into the space of the courtroom, so when we're back in there, which I'm not familiar with that, to anything to the degree that you are, but I did work on land claims a little bit. I didn't go into the legal aspects so much, but I worked on the attempts by the Gomani-San and to some degree the Nama to reconstitute a cultural identity and a claim to the land in the aftermath of the devastation of colonialism, capitalism, Christianity, all those global forces that fragment them, and therefore they have to struggle to put together a story that sounds convincing in a courtroom, a story of continuity to that identity. But the breaks and fissures in their accounts, which seem inconsistent and full of gaps, is precisely the reality effects of that history.
Exactly, and to blame them for that I think that's such a good point, because people say, where's your piece of paper to prove that?
Exactly, and they seem to be making it up. So a forensic approach will say, well, actually, you don't speak a San language, you don't speak a Nama language.
Yeah.
You lived in Athlone, and now so.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I mean, the trouble is, of course, is that there are charlatans as well.
Yes.
But
if you link it as a social ecological thing, where it doesn't fall into the trap of identitarian politics.
Yes.
It's not a right exclusively to the river or to the human component of it. It's a social ecological nexus that has the right.
Yes, well, yes, and you see, so I suppose the way I would see it is that the river is a being and people are beings, but the key thing is the interrelationships, which is what you're saying. You can, to the extent that there's a conflict between one being and another, it needs to be resolved in a way which is in the best interest of the whole community, which is not such a foreign concept. I mean, in law, people are always talking about the public interest or the interest of justice, or but particularly say the public interest. There's this idea that the collective interest should prevail over the individual interest, or if you've got two individuals at loggerheads, what is the outcome that's best for society? So, I mean, we both have the right to life, but if I rush at you with a panga, you can shoot me in self-defense. And what's happening in a sense there is society is taking the choice that if there's a conflict between two rights to life, we will not favor the aggressor. It's not in our interest to promote aggression, so you favor the defender in that situation. So, there are all those kinds of examples. So it seems to me that it's not beyond the realms of possibility that we could do this. And indigenous societies have found out how to do these things.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of movement in that area. Indigenous social movements are getting the ears of the judge, of the courts in interesting ways at a quite symbolic level. So let's look at the land claim of the Kumani San a while back. That was done for symbolic reasons. And Mbeki wanted a big claim to take care of the past. It was quite a pragmatic decision, because if you went into it, it would be into the details. I mean, Roger Channels will tell you, it's very difficult to know who really the community is. Yeah.
Yes.
It's very porous and contested at every level.
Yeah.
But I suppose there's something about this moment where the corporation is perhaps being seen to be the aggressor. So if it's Shell or Exxon or whatever, because it's very hard in this world to see some of the actions as beneficial at a planetary scale, at a national. So I'm just wondering whether there is, because the regime of property seems very powerful for the past few hundred years.
Yes.
And that's been the cosmology, as you were saying, of modern Western and I suppose even Soviet.
Yes.
So how does one shift that? Is the power still so firmly in the hands of...
I mean, from a practical level, the biggest difficulty is that the property owners got the money. So, when we fight Shell, I mean, our firm is terribly exposed right now. We've just lost this case. We don't have any money and thing, and our clients have to pay costs, and that will be a lot. But even to be able to afford experts and stuff like that. So we never play on a level playing field. It's always heavily skewed in favor of the owners, if I can put it crudely. So there's that sort of practical dimension. But I think what's interesting, I think there is a kind of a Shell moment happening right now. I've been quite surprised actually at how many South Africans have got very upset about this seismic. It's really gone off. And when you think about it, almost none of those people are directly affected. I mean, there are arguments about the Wild Coast communities being directly affected, but it's also true what Shell says is you can do. They've done seismic surveys off some of those coasts before, and nobody's noticed. So it's very interesting in the sense that the direct short-term impact on people is very minimal, but people are upset on behalf of the other species. People don't like the idea of whales being subjected to those kind of things, and I think the other dimension is that after we just had a COP, in Glasgow, the idea that these guys who have been ordered by a court in the Hague to reduce their global emissions by 47% by 2030, and the South African government, who's also, talking about all its contributions, how it's going to reduce gas, are looking for more, is irrational, but it also smacks of bad faith, and I mean, we know this, obviously the government, Gwede Mantashe has very clear views on this, and he doesn't hold any truck with climate change and things like that. So, but I've been very interested in it because I think it's united a wide range of people, and that people's visceral reaction is that this is wrong, and a lot of that is, I think, through a kind of what is the word that E.O. Wilson uses, biophilia, a kind of love for other species. There's also I think the fact that it's the wild coast is also significant. I think it's a bit like the Karoo, when they were wanting to frack in the Karoo. The Karoo is not just a place; it occupies a position in South African culture. The Karoo means something. There are poems about it. It's a imaginative space as well, and I think the wild coast is a little bit like that too. But even despite all of those things, I've been surprised by it. So I think it's also an indication that things are changing. And, we've lost today on the basis that we failed to show that there would be irreparable harm that justified stopping Shell until the court could hear the matter properly. And I don't think the public will accept that. The court may have ruled that, but I don't think it's going to change the view of the public. They don't think this should be happening now, and particularly I believe that Shell needs an environmental authorization and hasn't got one, and so that and I think that will be shown, but in the meantime, some seismic survey is highly likely to happen. So it means, and you can see Shell are completely mystified by this. They said, but we've done these before, lots of people have done them, what's the fuss now? And in a sense, they are caught unawares by the shift in public perception. And I think it fits very much with what we're talking about here. It's a particularly interesting example where it's not to do with self-interest. There's a huge outcry, and it's not really, very few of those people would have their lives are not going to be changed one way or the other whether the seismic surveys go ahead or not. I mean, in the longer term, yes, if they find reserves and they decide to exploit them and they emit more greenhouse gases, it could be very bad. But it's extraordinary, and in that sense, very promising.
It is. And as I mentioned to you on the phone, I went to this protest on, I think it was Wednesday, where we walked from Muizenberg to Cork Bay. And it was organized by young people, matriculants. They just finished matric. This is, part of their green club. They have a green club at various schools. And it was small, but the whole way there, people were hooting, and
that's wonderful.
Yeah, so there's something about the ocean. So somebody had a sign: "The ocean is life," or something. Love life, the ocean. So I think
but that's a very good example of what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, drivers who were coming past in trucks were hooting. I mean, there are possibilities in all of that. We don't know where it will go, but it has, as you say, kind of, it can draw in a wide range of people who aren't ordinarily political in a straightforward sense, but they can identify, they've been exposed, I think, also to the climate change media coverage, which has been escalating over the past few years. Maybe I'm watching very closely, but I have a sense that many people are, whereas you were there already in the early 2000s, I think many of us are, newcomers to realizing what we're going through.
Yeah, no, I certainly, I was studying my master's in environmental law in London at the time. They were negotiating the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change at the time of the first Earth Summit. But before that, I was already aware that climate change was a problem. But it's amazing how, I've got a book that was written more than 50 years ago by Duncan. His name is escaping from it. The surname is Duncan. His father was a governor of the Cape. His grandfather, Patrick Duncan. He was a member of the PAC. So he wrote a wonderful book, 50 years ago, and he mentions climate change. Patrick Duncan. It's confusing. He also has a son who's still alive called Patrick Duncan as well. So. Yeah, but I guess it's vested interest, isn't it? The vested interest in continuing to exploit the earth are enormous. Continuing to exploit the earth are enormous. Now with the tech companies, it's no longer true. But it used to be. If you looked at the biggest companies in the world, they were almost all oil and gas and mining. Now they've got the tech companies, but there was no doubt that it was profitable to exploit the earth. And that money is now fighting to continue that regime. But there are things stronger than money, and life is one of them. And so the diplomacy of life, if I can put it that way, or maybe it's just the impulse in living creatures to want to live and thrive, is I think more powerful. But I have no illusions about how difficult it's going to be. But anyway. Look, I think that I'm lucky enough to have lived long enough to see ideas which I thought were very much in the future beginning to come to fruition. To my amazement, I was asked to write a year or so ago. Asked to write a chapter for on Earth jurisprudence for the Oxford Handbook on International Environmental Law. Now it's like a standard, reputable textbook on international environmental law. And I said to them, you know that it's not really part of international environmental law at this point. And they said, no, we know, but that's the direction it's going to go. And so the mainstreaming effect of that, the book's been published, I haven't got a copy yet, but the book, it's mainstreamed in academia remarkably, slowly at first, but now really quickly. And that's made it's a sort of legitimate object of study. There have been books written about wild law and about things. So that's been good. But we don't have the luxury of waiting the normal period of time for ideas to change and filter through to society and begin to think. So yeah, I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, no, and it seems like this also filtered through. I think Belgium and Germany, New Zealand and various places are taking this up in
yeah, and indigenous people have played a really important role in it, and it's now it's been bubbling up from different sources, sometimes entirely sort of for unconnected reasons. It's not like it's all been organized, but yeah, this case. One of the reasons that I'm disappointed in not being able to come back to the court on this case is that there's the only bit of South African law that I'm aware of which opens a gap aside from African customary law, which has got elements in it. The only part of the statute is in the Integrated Coastal Management Act, which says that the coast, including these offshore areas, must be managed in the interest of the whole community, and which is defined to mean essentially life forms that depend on the coast, humans and other than humans. It's there because I drafted it.
I was wondering how that got there.
But I drafted that many years ago as a sort of buried treasure that we would dig up and use one day. And now I think it probably is the time. So I'd like to we made the argument in papers in another case which hasn't gone to court yet, but I'd like to make it in this one that that what is required is that the law requires an ecocentric approach to the marine environment. And obviously, if you could, judges will not know what to make of that argument, but obviously, if you establish that, it has a very big thing. You know, it won't be quite as far as recognizing that you can stand up in court on behalf of the whales, but it's getting there.
And also, I did a bit of work for these lawyers, Gordon Light, in fact. I don't know how he got hold of me in Graaff-Reinet. I think it was...
Oh, he's the fracking guy.
He's the fracking guy.
Okay, I was wondering where I knew the name from. Yeah,
So
yeah.
He asked me to... Essentially, they wanted to fly planes over the Maluti Mountains to look for fracking possibilities, so surveillance. And the argument was going to be around sacred spaces because of initiation, particularly Basotho people in the mountains. I was going to come in as an anthropologist.
Gosh, that's interesting.
It never went to court, but you know, I was trying to take very seriously that idea that the mountain could have this significance. And it was quite tricky because, you know, you're arguing that the initiates cannot be seen by others.
Oh, okay.
But there are planes flying over all the time. You know, so it's quite tricky.
Yeah.
And so it didn't, and I think there were technical grounds. I actually contacted Gordon Light the other day. So they got what they wanted, I think, and they didn't have to go that route. But just one thing, what I found, and I didn't read that widely, I read a couple of judgments, and I think it was forget the lawyer in Matatial who gave it to me, so he was working on it. And essentially those judgments were by African judges who were sort of plumbing their own cultural backgrounds, in a way, and talking about the dead and future generations as needing the land and the resources need to be protected for them. You know, so it was going beyond the strict idea
of they're protecting for the ancestors.
And for the future generations, so
That's
backwards and forwards.
That's very nice.
Yeah.
Gosh, I'd like to see those if you ever come across them.
Yeah, I've got the documents somewhere. So, you know, I think there are already expressions that could be interpreted as going beyond.
Yes, I agree. I think that one of the most potentially productive areas in South African law for this, which hasn't really been explored, is you know, the Constitution does recognise customary law to the extent that it's not in contradiction, doesn't contradict the Constitution or written laws, and I think that one could bring in some concepts that way, but it's as you probably know, it takes a lot of research and effort to bring that before the courts. You've got to establish that, you know, that exists this belief system and it's been around for a while and it's still there, you know, all of those kind of things. So normally, I mean, it would be a very, very good thing to do, because if you could come to court with, you know, very, very strong evidence, for example, that, I mean, the rivers being recognised in Australia as legal persons now, because in some of them, academics they come up with this lovely idea. They call it ancestral persons, you know, around this personhood thing. So there's a river there's a river spirit, or so the river is personified. And I think there probably are that here in Southern Africa as well. But, you know, if one could come to court with evidence that, say, the Venda people have long regarded this as sacred.
Could you not alter the time? You've been reading a lot about time and manipulation of time. Part of Matthew's thesis about how activists use time in interesting ways to slow it down, accelerate it, you know, tell a story. But could one not say these rights go backwards and forwards, like this judge seemed to do in that case? You know, so it's not just the rights that we find now, it's the ancestors, but it's also the future generations to come. And
so future generations is mentioned in section 24 of the Constitution of Environmental Rights. So notionally there isn't a problem in recognizing that. You know, if rights of nature were recognized, the argument is that they in a sense, they've always existed. It's just we recognizing them now. So that fits with taking off the blinkers. It's not. It's not about granting rights to nature. It's about recognizing a pre-existing reality. So if that were recognized, then the rights would originate from the universe, or from creation, or however you want to see it. Okay, so I've got to be available for that's. So I've got to be in the meeting at 2, so that's all right.
Yeah. Just one. The role of precedent. So, like Stephen says, there's court cases and there's certain judges that make certain judgments, and they can be beneficial to certain arguments, but also they can detract. Are we seeing sort of like this critical mass? Are we starting to see some precedents enabling a form of politics, like you're saying, environmental politics, environmental law? Or is that... So just
in South Africa?
Yeah, in South Africa. Because obviously across the world, and how that actually relates between contexts. So if you're saying, Ecuador have done this and this is what's happening, there's a movement, I don't think people, and judges and governments, they are aware of these things. So is this starting to happen, especially with the Shell case, and we're seeing more and more cases like the Cormac? Does it create a politics that enables the kind of work
jurisprudence?
Politics
or
exactly.
jurisprudence.
Yeah, exactly.
Look, I think Corlobeni's been important, the mining one in particular, where they got judgment, because, again, it sort of resonated with South Africans, not only because of the case, but it resonated with South Africans as, somebody can't just come and put a mine here in my garden against my will, but they can put a toll road through. If you wanted to put a toll road through Kenilworth or Rondebosch or something, it'd be a huge outcry, and the idea that you could do it without each individual person signing off on it would be regarded, but that's happening. So the right to sort of say no, I think, has now got a kind of popular resonance, which does influence the courts. I think, and so I think we're slowly moving in that direction, but. I think we're a long way. Well, I shouldn't say a long way. Things can change quickly too. Just from a practical point of view, I was involved in a judge's training course. There's a Judicial Institute for Africa at UCT, and they asked it was about environmental law to teach, but I said, well, I would do it, but I really wanted to talk more about rights of nature. And I persuaded them to invite the head of the New South Wales Land and Environment Court, who's very much thinks like this, and the thing for a judge is that it's almost personal. They don't want to go out. They're not the kind of people who want to go out on limbs and be seen as radical. But if you bring a judge from another jurisdiction and you say, this is how you can start bringing these ideas into your jurisprudence in a completely legitimate way, you can just literally see them thinking, oh, that's interesting, and there's sort of safety in numbers, or it becomes legit. And there are some interesting cases. There's judgments in judgment from India where they explain quite practically why you need an ecocentric approach. That the idea that you can just approach some of these problems from just looking at one species is never going to work. And so once judges, in the beginning, I think it's very, very difficult to get a judge to takes a special judge to go out on a limb. But once there are a few out there, it becomes much easier for the others. And also being able to refer to academic writings is another one. Things gain a kind of so in a funny kind of way. Social legitimacy is important even in the court. So, for example, in the judgment today, the judge referred to the fact one of the things that had influenced him on the question of urgency was that he said the public interest in this matter is palpable. So that, he's noticed, he's seen all the protests and stuff, and that does affect the judges. And he also clearly knew there'd be lots of eyes on him, So I suppose law is, if you like, a product of society. So when society starts moving in a direction, it's much more likely that the law will start moving in that direction. The trouble is that law doesn't reflect society as a whole. It reflects the interests of the parts of society that have been able to exercise, to influence it. And up to now, the corporates have been past masters at influencing law. They pay lobbyists, they think about it a lot, they spend a lot of money on it. Communities in Kolobeni don't. But once they become social movements and you get a lot of people following, or like this, it changes. Yeah. So I haven't really answered your question. There's not a lot of jurisprudence in South Africa, but I think it will come, and I think it's starting. But every case now is a step forward. I mean, if I would like to present these arguments in this case now, but now that we have to decide maybe this afternoon if we're going to apply for leave to appeal. I think there's a meeting. Well, I've been sitting here. Meeting's been set up at 2, so there'll be a discussion about that. But I mean, again, all of these things are about money. If you go down against Shell, you're going down from a lot of money.
Anton Rupert won't help you out.
I don't know.
But
I don't. The trouble is, what's frustrating for me is that we've been all flat out working on the legal stuff. We don't have time to organise the fundraising. People have phoned us and said, "I'll give you 100,000," and I don't have somebody to set up the arrangement to get that 100,000 from them and deal with it. And that's where the NGOs could help, and they haven't. Anyway, I'm going to tell them no uncertain terms this afternoon.
So I just want to interject. And Natural Justice, I believe they're working on the case because they're also working on the PHA.
So Melissa Groening,
yeah.
So she's been a lawyer of ours for years, and then started working for Natural Justice 25%, and now she's working mainly for Natural Justice, but she's still a consultant, still an attorney with us. So in this case, she's kind of wearing 2 hats. I think I see she gave an interview now on TV while we've been sitting here, but she probably spoke as Natural Justice, but she's been working as part of our team, the Cullinan's team, for doing it. So we do work very closely together with Natural Justice. They're a client in this matter, not the lawyers in the matter, because they aren't a law firm, so they can't litigate. So that's what.
Yeah. So the context in South Africa is I think it's very complicated. What a cliche. So we have the argument that Greta Montashe would articulate is we in the global south are not really we're not responsible for the emissions. The global north needs to sort that out. And we need development, we need jobs, we need investment. And we need to keep the unions on our side. And so how does one work with that? In this context, what's the relationship between law and politics? And there's a kind of, there's statements from Barbara Creasy, the Minister of dealing with environmental issues. One doesn't know where the state lies in all of this. Or is it straightforward? We need to continue along this fossil fuel path for the next 2 decades.
Look, there are different views in the state, there's no question about it. The Department of Environmental Affairs wanted us to succeed in this application, but weren't prepared to say so publicly, and obviously Greta Montashe didn't. So I think it's fair to say that it's not a monolith, and it's contested within the state as it is in society. I think there are fundamental problems though with politicians are operating on 4-year terms of office. They need to deal with particular practical problems. They are susceptible to influence from well-organized and well-funded constituencies or interest groups. And it seems to me that the way the system works, it mainly promotes. It doesn't promote the best people. Sorry, I'm just checking that I don't have to do anything while we're here.
No problem. I'm sorry, we're sort of interrupting what is clearly a busy day.
Yeah, it's just it's just that the press thinks they don't wait. looks like they've already been about 4 interviews since this morning. But there's a media person who volunteered to keep going. So she just messages me like, if you somebody wants to interview in 10 minutes, then you've got to do it. But so far, my colleagues have done it. But yeah, my view is that the politicians are unlikely to lead on these things, but they are sensitive to following. So, for an example is this case. So, no sooner is it gains, do they see a whole lot of people moving in one direction, that we get a call from AfriForum who want us to act for them. Because AfriForum, as you probably know, I mean, one of their strategies clearly is to get involved in high-profile litigation that appeals to their support base. That's how So they approached us, and then we got some other group who I don't even know, United or something, but they're against lockdowns or something. But everybody's trying to hitch their wagon to this, you see. And then I read in the press that the DA is now against the seismic, So what I mean is that people who care about politics, not necessarily about the earth, if they see a whole lot of people moving in one direction, they chase them. And so we need a lot of people moving in this direction, and then the politicians will start running after us. Then they might help us, but I don't think they're going to lead this. So they're not irrelevant because they've got access to power and stuff like. They can change laws and do things like that. But they, and also in terms of thought leadership, you're not going to find it in many government departments.
It's true.
I mean, it was a bit different just after '94, but now, Gwede Mantashe would do well in the 50s.
That's right.
But his ideas are just hopelessly out of date now.
He is a dinosaur. I want to ask you whether this seems similar to the Treatment Action Campaign case, in that a group of activists, they were very well organized, and their focus was very clear on getting treatment at a time many people were dying of HIV, and there was a moral clarity to what they were about, and the public understood it. It may not be the same with environmental and climate change issues, but the global pharmaceutical industry backed off because this was bad for the brand. At a certain point, the activists were portraying them as profiteering and uninterested in the welfare of people, and they realized this wasn't good, and they withdrew that case. Is Shell going to find itself, does this case have the potential for that? Because it's not very good for the brand. They invest a lot in environmental, what some call greenwashing.
I think you're absolutely right about that. I think that they're shocked. I think their PR people must be tearing their hair out, I think that's why they gave an undertaking. That because we one of the reasons why we moved so fast is you could see that they'd suddenly started, their ship was accelerating up the coast and hadn't stopped in Port Elizabeth, and so we thought these guys are going to start on the first, and so we accelerated it because of that was one of the reasons. So they then gave an undertaking that they wouldn't start before the judgment today, and I'm sure that was because of their PR people, because we were going on press and saying it would be really bad faith. It may not be unlawful, but it would be bad faith to do that. Now it'll be interesting to see whether they give an undertaking. It may also be that the ship wasn't quite ready, but now it'll be interesting to see. I think the other case is going to court next week. I'm not sure, I forget the date, but it'll be interesting to see if they extend the undertaking to that or not. But I think what's really interesting is these guys take the view that there's no evidence of dolphins or cetaceans being stranded or physically hurt, so what's the problem? But if you think about it, there's probably not many examples of people bleeding from the ears or throwing themselves off buildings for sound, but sound can have a big impact on you before you bleed from the ears or throw yourself off a building, and that's kind of the point. So, and we're not unlike marine creatures, we're not species who've evolved to be specifically sensitive to sound. you know, in the marine environment sounds like the equivalent of light, you know. Anyway, sorry, I digress. But I think that, you know, how corporations talk about social license to operate, that in addition to the formal legal licenses, you kind of got to, society's got to be willing for you to operate in there. And I think that's what they're going to be worried about now, is that people are going to protest against Shell selling petrol everywhere because they don't like them anymore. And they don't, and I mean, those 35 petrol stations in the Eastern Cape withdrawing was amazing. I was really surprised by that, you know. And at a certain point, once you're identified as the bad guy, it doesn't even matter what you do anymore, you know. It doesn't even matter to come back and explain to people that these loud underwater noises don't cause quite as much harm as you think. People don't give a stuff, you know. So
they had bad press in Ogoniland with Ken
Yes.
Sarawira, and I suppose they thought they'd got over that and people had forgotten it, and now this comes up. But is this not also part of this global move to mine the sea, and the Russians are moving in, and
it's
China,
and it's,
you know.
I mean, more it is, but more directly, it's Operation Pakisa of Zuma, you know, that whole thing. So it's that playing out, you know, that we've, you know, there's a whole new frontier for us to exploit, and that's really the thing is that, do we stop that? I mean, I'm involved. I'll have to go just now, but maybe just mention one more thing. I'm involved also in an initiative to produce a declaration for Antarctica. And we had a webinar actually on the day of the hearing of this on the 1st, so this week. But that's very interesting in this context, because Antarctica is the only place on the globe where the colonial project is incomplete. I think might be subject to correction, but you know, there are claims on Antarctica, but they were frozen by the Antarctic Treaty System. So it's no country owns any bit of Antarctica. So what we want a declaration which says that Antarctica is autonomous. It doesn't need people to govern it. It can govern itself. But also involved in that would be the recognition of Antarctica as an entity, a legal entity, so that you could potentially stand up in a court in Paris and say you need to cut your greenhouse gas emissions because it's hurting Antarctica. You know, so it's a completely different rethinking of the paradigm of the current Antarctic Treaty System. But I'm just giving it as an example of the presupposition is that at some point somebody's going to mine Antarctica, and the Russians and the Chinese, etc., are moving in that direction, and we basically are trying to establish a situation where we say no, that colonial ownership, dominance, exploitative approach has reached its high watermark and needs to retreat, and from now on no more, basically. So that is very significant globally. But in relation to the TRC thing, I think you do raise a good point about that. I mean, I suppose the difference with some of what we're talking about here is that a lot of the social justice litigation that's happened in the past has been within the context of an accepted legal system and an accepted framework. And what we are saying is that the framework's wrong. It's too narrow. So it's a much more long-term project and a much deeper project.
And finally, because you do need to go, so you get lots of messages. Kevin Bloom and Maverick had this webinar yesterday, and you know, one of the things they were talking about, it's quite interesting, I watched part of it. They were talking about having to create a reserve for 30% of the planet, where there will be no development. There's something along those lines.
I know there's been a movement called Nature Needs Half or something, but
yeah, some say
that
50%,
wasn't all.
Some
That wasn't.
say 30%,
Yeah, it wasn't exactly.
yeah.
It wasn't all protected
Yeah,
areas, but yeah.
I imagine what you're talking about, Antarctica. I mean, that's a massive area. So you know, if one gets that, it builds what's one part of this bigger story of.
It's a liberated zone.
That's right.
But the difficulty, of course, is that although I've got a lot of sympathies with those approaches, is the problem is everything's interconnected. So actually, you can't protect Antarctica except by acting on people very far from Antarctica, because of climate change, for example. So, the Antarctic system is built up as, okay, we've got this Antarctic area and we regulate what people do in that area. And that worked at one time, but now it doesn't, because Antarctica is melting not for what people are doing in the Antarctic area. So I mean, I have a lot of sympathy with what people are trying to achieve with those movements, but actually the problem is in our heads. You can't just fix it by fencing off areas, because it's the drivers of the destruction are how people see the world, and that's why if you look at the measures that have been taken to address the catastrophic losses in biodiversity, they've failed hopelessly. They didn't make a single one of the HE targets over 10 years. And the reason is, and the scientific reports say that, is because you achieve things, you achieve protected areas, etc., and you expand them or whatever, but the drivers of destruction haven't been touched. More is better. We want to take, and so you have to get down to that level, and that's why one gets into the deeper philosophical conversations, because that's the root of the problem. And I somebody once said, in fact, it was a philosophy professor from Stellenbosch, I've forgotten his name. He once asked me years ago, and I think it was shortly after Wild Law was published, do you think that you can fix these problems without taking an ecocentric approach? Which was quite an interesting question. And I thought about it, and I eventually said, no. It's extremely hard to get people to take an ecocentric approach, but I don't think it's actually can be avoided. Because that's the nature of how the world works. That it's not. Anyway, sorry, I've digressed all over the place.
Social, ecological. You see, because it's the social, not the link, because that's the whole human rights paradigm of the 20th century. And you've got to splice it onto the ecological to make it something that's legible, it's comprehensible to people who think of nature as resource.
Yes, that is right. I mean, I suppose I'm seeing people as a subset of nature.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, in terms of the problem, we don't actually have. The problem is not that climate change is not the problem. It's a symptom of the problem. So the problem, we have a cultural problem, and that because of the culture that generates the emissions that generates the climate change. But if it were just, that's why all this focus on just cutting emissions. I mean, yes, we need to do that, absolutely. But why are we emitting so much in the first place? And why are people still trying to emit more? Why is Shell still looking for more oil and gas now at this point in history? It's clearly insane at a global level. We know that we can only burn 40% of the known reserves. So the 60% of what they really can't burn, and they're looking for more. So it's deeply antisocial and deeply irrational if you look at it at a global level. But for a Shell executive, they will, if they find more reserves and they get the right to exploit it, it'll be an asset on the balance sheet, and the company will be worth more, and they'll probably get a big fat bonus. So it's absolutely rational at the level of the Shell executive to carry on. I mean, maybe not rational, but in this narrow self-interest to carry on. But so I don't know. We do have people who think it's in the national interest to exploit there and build a smart city on the Wild Coast built on as an oil gas hub.
I'm afraid so. Degrowth is a hard argument to sell for many people. We actually read this Hickel book. Do you know it?
I've
Jason
heard about it.
Hickel.
Yeah, but I
very
haven't
good.
read it. Yeah,
it's actually very good.
The degrowth. Yeah, I mean, I think that they're right, but I just wouldn't phrase it in that way. That's the thing, because there are so many benefits. I mean, the benefits of being able to indigenize oneself to the extent that you realize that you're a member of the most incredible community of life we've found in the universe is a great feeling. and it's a real tangible immediate benefit, which will result in better health, better mental health, all kinds of things, and those are the kinds of payoffs you get from shifting